Welcome to Alice Chapter 8. This chapter is called The Queen's Croquet Ground. A large rose tree stood near the entrance of the garden. Its roses were white, but there were 3 gardeners at it, busily painting them red. Alice thought this was a very curious thing, and she went nearer to watch them. Just as she came up to them, she heard one of them say, "Look out now, Five, don't go splashing me with paint like that." "I couldn't help it," said Five in a sulky tone. "Seven jogged my elbow." On which Seven looked up and said, "That's right, Five, always blame the others." "You'd better not talk," said Five. "I heard the Queen say only yesterday you deserve to be beheaded." "What for?" said the one who had spoken first. "It's none of your business, Two," said Seven. "Yes, it is his business," said Five, "and I'll tell him. It was for bringing the cooked tulip roots instead of onions." Seven flung down his brush and had just begun, "Well, of all the unjust things," when his eyes chanced to fall upon Alice as she stood watching them, and she checked herself suddenly. The others looked round also, and all of them bowed low. "Would you tell me," said Alice, a little timidly, "why you painting those roses?" Five and Seven said nothing, but looked at Two. Two began in a low voice. "Why, the fact is, you see, miss, this ought to have been a red rose tree, and we put a white in one by mistake. And if the Queen was to find out, we'd all have heads cut off, you know. So you see, miss, we're doing our best before she comes to—" At this moment, Five, who'd been anxiously looking across the garden, called out, "The Queen! The Queen!" And the 3 gardeners instantly threw themselves flat upon their faces. There was the sound of many footsteps, and Alice looked around, eager to see the Queen. First came 10 soldiers carrying clubs. These were all shaped like 3 gardeners, oblong and flat, with their heads and feet at corners. Next, 10 courtiers. These were ornamented with diamonds, and walked 2 by 2 as the soldiers did. After them came the royal children. There were 10 of them, and the little dears were jumping merrily hand in hand or in couples. They were all ornamented with hearts. Next came the guests, mostly kings and queens, but amongst them Alice recognised the White Rabbit. He was talking in a hurried, nervous manner, smiling at everything that was said, and went by without noticing her. Then followed the Knave of Hearts, carrying the king's crown on a crimson velvet cushion, and last of all, in this grand procession, came the King and Queen of Hearts. Alice was rather doubtful as whether she should lie down on her face like the 3 gardeners, but she could not remember ever having heard such a rule at processions, and besides, what would the use of a procession be, she thought, if people had to lie down on their faces so they couldn't see it? So she stood where she was, and she waited. When the procession came opposite to Alice, they all stopped and looked at her. The Queen said severely, "Who's this?" She said it to the Knave of Hearts, who only bowed and smiled in reply. "Idiot," said the Queen, tossing her head impatiently, and turning to Alice went on, "What's your name, child?" "My name is Alice, so please your Majesty," said Alice very politely, but she added to herself, "Why, they're only a pack of cards after all. I needn't be afraid of them." "And who are these?" said the Queen, pointing at the 3 gardeners who were lying around the rose tree, for you see they were lying on their faces, and the pattern on the backs was the same as the rest of the pack. So she could not tell whether they were gardeners, or soldiers, or courtiers, or 3 of her own children. "How would I know?" said Alice. "It's no business of mine." The Queen turned crimson with fury, and glaring at her for a moment like a wild beast, screamed, "Off with her head! Off!" "Nonsense," said Alice, very loudly and decidedly, and the Queen was silent. The King laid his hand upon her arm, and timidly said, "Consider, my dear, she's only a child." The Queen turned angrily away from him, and said to the Knave, "Turn them over." The Knave did so, very carefully, with one foot. "Get up," said the Queen, in a shrill, loud voice, and the 3 gardeners instantly jumped up, and began by bowing to the Queen, the royal children, and everybody else. "Leave off that," said the Queen, "you make me giddy." And then, turning to the rose tree, she went on, "What have you been doing here?" "May it please your Majesty," said Two, in a very humble tone, going down on one knee as he spoke, "we were trying—" "I see," said the Queen, who had been meanwhile examining the roses. Off with their heads!" And the procession moved on, the 3 soldiers remaining behind to execute the unfortunate gardeners, who ran to Alice for protection. "You shan't be beheaded," said Alice, and she stuffed them in a large flower pot that stood near her. The 3 soldiers wandered about for a minute or two looking for them, then quietly marched off after the others. "Are their heads off?" said the Queen. "Their heads gone, if it please your Majesty," the soldiers shouted in reply. "That's right," shouted the Queen. "Can you play croquet?" The soldiers were silent and looked at Alice, as the question was evidently meant for her. "Yes," shouted Alice. "Come on then," roared the Queen, and Alice joined the procession, wondering very much what would happen next. It's a very fine day," said a timid voice at her side. She was walking next to the White Rabbit, who was peeping anxiously into her face. "Very," said Alice. "Where's the Duchess?" "Hush, hush," said the Rabbit in a low, hurried tone. He looked anxiously over his shoulder as he spoke, and then raised himself up onto tiptoe and put his mouth close to her ear, and whispered, "She's under sentence of execution." "What for?" said Alice. "Did you say what a pity?" said the Rabbit. "No, I didn't," said Alice. "I don't think it's at all a pity. I said what for." "She boxed the Queen's ears," the Rabbit began. Alice gave a little scream of laughter. "Oh, hush!" the Rabbit whispered in a frightened tone. "The Queen will hear you. You see, she came rather late, and the Queen said—" "Get to your places!" shouted the Queen in a voice of thunder, and people began running around in all directions, tumbling up against each other. However, they got settled down in a minute or two, and the game began. Alice thought she'd never seen such a curious game of croquet in her life. It was all ridges and furrows. The balls were live hedgehogs, and the mallets flamingos, and the soldiers had to double themselves up and stand on their hands and feet to make arches. The chief difficulty Alice found was managing her flamingo. She succeeded in getting its body tucked away comfortably enough under her arm, with its legs hanging down, but generally, just as it got its neck nicely straightened out and was going to give the hedgehog a blow on its head, it would twist itself and look up at her face with such a puzzled expression that she could not help burst out laughing. And when she'd got its head down and was going to begin again, it was very provoking to find that the hedgehog had unrolled itself and was in fact crawling away. Beside all of this, there was generally a ridge or a furrow in the way, where she wanted to send the hedgehog to. And as the doubled-up soldiers were always getting up and walking off in other parts of the ground, Alice soon came to the conclusion that it was a very difficult game indeed. The players all played at once without waiting for turns, quarrelling all the time, fighting over the hedgehogs. And every time the Queen was in a furious passion and went stamping about, shouting, "Off with his head!" or "Off with her head!" about every once a minute. Alice began to feel very uneasy, to be sure. She had not yet had any dispute with the Queen, but she knew it might happen at any minute. And then she thought, what will become of me? They're dreadfully fond of beheading people here, and the great wonder is that there's anyone left alive. She was looking for some way to escape, and wondering whether she'd get away without being seen, when she noticed a very curious appearance in the air. It puzzled her very much at first, but after watching it for a minute or two, she made it out to be a grin, and she said to herself, "It's the Cheshire Cat. Now I shall have someone to talk to." "How are you getting on?" said the cat, as soon as there was enough for it to speak with. Alice waited till the eyes appeared, then nodded. "It's no use speaking to it," she thought, "until its ears have come, or at least one of them." In another minute the whole head appeared. Alice put down her flamingo and began an account of the game. Feeling very glad she had someone to listen to, the cat seemed to think there was enough of it now in sight, and no more of it appeared. "I don't think they play at all fairly," said Alice, in a rather complaining tone, "and they all quarrel dreadfully, and one can't hear oneself speak. And then they don't seem to have any rules. At least, if there are, nobody attends to them. You have no idea how confusing it is for all these things to be alive, for instance. And there's the arch I have to go through, walking about next on the other end of the ground. I should have croqueted the Queen's hedgehog just now, but it ran away when it saw mine coming." "How do you like the Queen?" said the cat in a low voice. "Not at all," said Alice. "She's so extremely—" Just then she noticed the Queen was close behind her listening, so she went on, "likely to win, and that's hardly worth finishing the game." The Queen smiled and passed on. "Who are you talking to?" said the king, going up to Alice, looking at the cat's head with great curiosity. "A friend of mine," said Alice, "a Cheshire cat. Allow me to introduce it." "I don't like the look of it at all," said the king. "However, it may kiss my hand if it likes." "I'd rather not," said the cat. "Don't be impertinent," said the king, "and don't look at me like that." He got behind Alice as he spoke. "A cat may look at a king," said Alice. "I've read that in a book, but I don't remember where." "Well, it must be removed," said the king very decidedly, and he called after the queen. "My dear, I wish you'd have this cat removed." The queen had only one way of settling all difficulties, great or small. "Off with its head," she said, without even looking around. "I'll fetch the executioner myself," the king said eagerly, and hurried off. Alice thought she might as well go back and see how the game was going, and she heard the queen's voice in the distance, screaming with passion. She had already heard her sentence 3 of the players to be executed for having missed their turns, and she did not like the look of things, as the game was in such confusion, and she never knew which way to turn. So she went in search of a hedgehog. The hedgehog was engaged in a fight with another hedgehog, which seemed to Alice an excellent opportunity for croqueting one of them with the other. The only difficulty was that a flamingo was gone to the other side of the garden, where Alice could see it trying helpless sort of way to fly up into a tree. By the time she had caught the flamingo and brought it back, the fight was over and both the hedgehogs were out of sight. "Doesn't matter much," thought Alice. "All the archers are gone from this side of the ground." So she tucked it away under her arm, they might not escape again, and went back for a little more conversation with her friend. When she got back to the Cheshire Cat, she was surprised to see quite a large crowd collected around it. There was a dispute going on between the executioner, the king, and the queen, who were all talking at once, while the rest were quite silent and looked uncomfortable. The moment Alice appeared, she was appealed to by all 3 to settle the question. They repeated their arguments to her, though they all spoke at once, so she found it very difficult to find out what they said. The executioner argument was that you couldn't cut off a head unless there was a body to cut it off from, and that he'd never had to do such a thing before, and he wasn't going to begin in this time of life. The king's argument was anything had a head could be beheaded, and that you shouldn't talk nonsense. And the queen's argument was if something wasn't done about it in less time, she'd have everybody executed all round. And the last remark was the thing that made the whole party look grave and anxious. Alice could think of nothing else to say. "It belongs to the Duchess. You better ask her about it." "She's in prison," said the queen to the executioner. "Fetch her here." And the executioner went off like an arrow. The cat's head began fading away the moment she was gone. By the time he had come back with the Duchess, it had entirely disappeared, so the king and the executioner ran wildly up and down looking for it, while the rest of the party went back to the game. That's the end of the chapter. The next chapter, chapter 9, is called The Mock Turtle Story. See you then.